to say, but it's not as much as before. It's going to be a little bit of a different topic, fiqh of transactions a little bit, not too much, but I guess explaining some basics of it for us to kind of get the hang of it. And inshallah, we are going to be starting.
Yeah, I think I think the
Right.
fiqh of transactions is important because a lot of sisters have businesses.
Right. So, inshallah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, inshallah, we're going to continue what we did last time. So, yesterday we were doing مَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ قُلْ لَا يَسْتَوِي الْخَبِيثُ وَالطَّيِّبُ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب لعلكم تفلحون. So we went in details in regards to, let's call it the surface tafsir. We still didn't go into the details yet. So let's see what al-Qurtubi wanted to say in regards to those ayat. Really quick, we said مَا عَلَى رَسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغ, telling us that the Prophet's main mission is to deliver the message, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what people are, this is revealing and concealing. And of course, within this statement, وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ would simply mean that your job is to recognize that you have to implement what the Prophet ﷺ had been delivered, the messages that he was was delivered to him, and then those messages were delivered onto you. So when you look at وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ, then in that situation, your responsibility, on the other hand, is to implement it and recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of how you implement such rulings, such principles, how you live by it, how you embrace it, and what you do with it. Therefore, it is telling us that there was one responsibility on the Prophet, which is to give you the information. Your responsibility is how you would embrace it, how you would apply it, how would you relate to it, etc. قُلْ لَا يَسْتَوِي الْخَبِيثُ وَالطَّيِّبُ. If one were to put, of course, a question and say, well, there is no difference between right and wrong. It's all about a perspective. It's all about preference. It's all about orientation, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is responding to it that it's actually not equal. Then you cannot whatsoever claim that wrong is equal to good. And even if we're talking about many people perhaps embracing the wrong, it does not necessarily equal to good, and it doesn't make it good because more and more people are accepting it. So when we're speaking about more people accepting, that's not necessarily the paradigm that we would use in order to define what makes something as, let's say, acceptable. فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب. So coming with the same concept right here. So now that you recognize that there is a specific paradigm, there's a specific classification of what makes something right, what makes something wrong, then in that situation, your responsibility is فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب. You would have to have that taqwa, shield yourself with the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is what is going to lead to you getting more clarity. So look at that, Ya Ulil Albab, giving you more clarity in understanding things, and certainly guidance in wanting to apply the right things. لعلكم تفلحون, for that leads to success. ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ, سورة الذاريات. Right now. No. سورة الذاريات. ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ, meaning that this ayah is basically saying, when you're looking at the word illa is to show that something is exclusive. Illa is to tell you that all the other things are not included, and illa is adat istithna. Istithna, which means to show and indicate exclusivity. So right there, it's basically telling you that the Prophet ﷺ, his responsibility is not to guide you of course, in the specific sense. He's to give you the guidance. He's to give you the information. He's to show you what it means to be in guidance. But then you have to choose the right path. You have to basically show that consistency. And the Prophet ﷺ certainly does not have the power to reward, because his responsibility is exclusive to inform you the message of Tawheed and the message of Sharia. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind, because it is to tell us that the Prophet's message that the Prophet's responsibility is basically exclusive to letting you know and giving you al-wusul, and giving you, of course, that information to let you know that it basically had reached you. Then you don't have the justification to say, well, I didn't know, or I had no information. So therefore, your responsibility, which is the communal responsibility, is to basically deliver the message and, of course, the legacy of the Prophet. Let's see. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ مَا تُظْهِرُونَهُ. So this يَعْلَمُ means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you would reveal, and certainly what a person is revealing, whether we're speaking about behaviors, and ma taktumun, and what you conceal is speaking about intentions. Okay, so when you're speaking about what you reveal, you're revealing perhaps a certain behavior you're doing, perhaps what choices you're making, etc. But then ma taktumun is basically referring to the intention, whether we're speaking about a person's intention within their heart, faith, hypocrisy, lacking sincerity, and so forth. Then in that situation, this is basically to tell us and indicate what does it mean to tubdun, and what does it mean to تكتمون. قل لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب ولو أعجبك كثرة الخبيث فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب. قل لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب. That al-khabith, so here's the, even though, like we said, whenever you would have that al, is it an inclusive al-istighraqiyya, or is it a specifying al? So when you look at al-khabith, are we talking about an inclusive khabith? Are we talking about an inclusive word to include all types? Are we talking about an exclusive one, or a specifying word to mean that it is exclusive to a particular thing? And that's where you would see the different tafsir, the different scholars in tafsir giving you the different interpretations. So you had some scholars regarded as a specifying al, and they, in the first opinion, said, well, this is to show the contrast. So when you're talking about al-khabith and al-tayyib, al-khabith would be referring to haram, and al-tayyib would be referring to al-halal. Okay, so this, according to the first opinion, they considered that this is to show the contrast, that that number one, referring to al-khabith meaning al-haram, al-tayyib meaning al-halal. The second opinion basically said al-mu'min and al-kafir. That's the second opinion, considered al-khabith is to refer to al-kafir, and al-tayyib is to refer to the believer. In other words, the context would be that a believer and a disbeliever are not necessarily equal, and therefore, even if you were to see a large number in the population of disbelievers, probably in a bigger population, that doesn't necessarily make them better and does not necessarily make them right. Let's see, al-muti' wal-'asi. So the third opinion considered that al-khabith is to refer to al-asi, the sinner, and the tayyib is to refer to the obedient one. So in that context, it would, and based on that interpretation, that a person that is a sinner is not equal to a person that is obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if the sinners were in larger numbers, it doesn't necessarily make them better. Now, let's look at the fourth opinion. The fourth opinion said, no, this is talking about something that is good and something that is bad in general. So looking at it, I guess, from an ethical standpoint. And here al-Qurtubi said, وَالصَّحِيحُ أَنَّ اللَّفْظَ عَامٌ فِي جَمِيعِ الْأُمُورِ. Al-Qurtubi commented and he said, what is actually authentic and what is preponderant, and looking at it and considered that this statement is more comprehensive and is not necessarily exclusive to one particular type of good, and therefore it is inclusive to one legislation in terms of halal haram, or whether in terms of people, mu'min kafir, or iman and kufr, or whether we're speaking about people in terms of a person that is obedient and a person that is a sinner, or generally ethics, whether we're speaking about good ethics or wrong, illicit ethics, or whatever it is. This is basically in order to show the contrast and that they're not equal and that they would not necessarily be on the same level, and that there needs to be a type of a type of a classification, two, a recognition that they're not equal, and three, the implication therefore is not the same. Whether we're speaking about, let's do it again. So we're talking about the actual thing, whether we're speaking about an idea, a wrong idea is not the same thing as a right idea. Two, we're speaking about in terms of people as well. It's the behavior is going to be completely different. The implication is going to be completely different. And in the long term as well, the implication, or at least the consequence, is also going to be different. So when you're looking at that, that's why when it took us into recognizing the foundation of it, then talked about, well, the application, and even though people might confuse the different matters, and finally it said, well, لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. Now you look at the farther end, which is the consequence of things. So this is really important, how we classify and the different routes that we take to recognize where and what is basically affecting and leading to a certain matter in the long run. فَالْخَبِيثُ مِنْ هَذَا كُلِّهِ لَا يُفْلِحُ وَلَا يُنْجِبُ. So at the end, of course, wanted to say that even if it's a large number, at the end it will not it will not necessarily give a good result. So even if it might seem that it's heading towards the right direction, even though it might seem that way, but at the end it will not give the good result. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that if it is good, you're going to see that the ending is going to lead to good, even though the struggle might not be a pleasant feeling in the beginning, but certainly the outcome is going to be pleasant. Well, and that's very similar to the ayah. وَالْبَلَدُ الطَّيِّبُ يَخْرُجُ نَبَاتُهُ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ وَالَّذِي خَبُثَ لا يخرج إلا نكدا. Very similar to this ayah. والبلد الطيب يخرج نباته بإذن ربه. When you're speaking about والبلد الطيب, I'm going to first interpret this one. You could see in Surah Al-A'raf, البلد الطيب, what is البلد الطيب? البلد الطيب actually means the city that is a healthy city, but this isn't talking about a healthy city or a fertile land. that its crops basically come by the order of it and the will of its Lord Almighty, and those that are bad crops, I guess they would only come in distress. Is that what it's saying? So not really. It's basically telling us that a good foundation brings in a good consequence. And therefore, similar to the different plants, to the different natural things that you would see in the world around you, if you were to have a foundation, probably you were looking at a fertile land, you're looking at good seeds, then you're going to get a good production. You're going to get a good production if you basically gave it the right, I guess, the right way of, I guess, maintaining those crops, etc. Then what you're going to get the result coming in. Coming in the result based on what you had invested. And that's why it said, وَالَّذِي خَبُثَ لَا يَخْرُجُ إِلَّا نَكِدًا. But if you had a non-fertile land and you even had probably bad seeds, then at the end, the result is going to be nekida. So the word nekida, it can mean to go in distress. It could also mean in naked, could also be contaminated. In naked could also be in anxiety, could also be in a bad result. Okay, so وَالَّذِي خَبُثَ, لَا يَخْرُجُ إِلَّا نَكِدًا, and that's really to tell us the same thing. And where you're looking at those paradigms to see that the foundation is going to lead to a certain consequence. Same thing if you're raising a child. If you're going to be raising a child from the early childhood, if the children are exposed to probably the wrong social media, the wrong, the wrong environment, the wrong student, etc., you're going to see a child that is most likely going to be based on what they had been exposed to and what they had been raised in. They're most likely going to be coming out in the long run, whether it's talking about maybe not successful, maybe wrong behavior, maybe certainly wrong in their deen, and the list goes on and on. So we're talking about environment, we're talking about source, we're talking about the field that it's growing in. And this is basically supposed to be the responsibility of what choices we make. We need to recognize, just because you have probably cropped a good amount of, perhaps a good amount of wrong seeds, you cannot expect that one of them and many are just going to get into a good result, because at the end, if you don't do it right, don't expect it just because, oh, I put a large amount that it's going to work out and that's it. I'm just going to let it go. You have to definitely take in consideration the basis of it, the seed, the environment, certainly the ground that you are cropping in. And of course, all of this is metaphorical, but you can really see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did show us different markers and different paradigms to tell us that what you would see in terms of different laws, whether we were talking about biology or whether different laws in physics or different laws that you probably will apply even on a narrowed down system. Perhaps like he would give an example, well, how would you think if you had a slave and this slave was working for someone else and not you, and then certainly can they come and claim that they needed to get the reward for it or anything like that? Well, the answer is, of course not. So the Quran uses these parables often and basically lets us know that you could see through these paradigms, these parables, just an idea of how to understand the foundations of things, the consequences of things. In other words, lay out the paradigms. And that's why some scholars actually wrote some books in in fiqh, they're actually called al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir. I'm going to write that name. Al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir. So what are al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir? Al-ashbah are basically the things that are similar. In-nadha'ir are the things that are probably contrast to things. So you're looking at the similar things and the things that are probably the whatever is contrast to it or whatever is opposing it. But you have to see these paradigms of what is similar and what leads to basically similar rulings. And same thing, if things are in contrast, then what do we get out of all of this? So it's all really studying the different paradigms by looking at what rulings we have in the Quran and the Sunnah to understand a legal maxim. To understand a legal maxim, you're going back to the foundations of Quran and Sunnah and trying to investigate, scrutinize, looking at the rulings and the reason for such rulings and looking at the consequence. And that's how they got to, as a legal maxim, that the religion is all about preservation of deen, nafs, aql, ird, mal. And we talked about this, the preservation of one, religion, spirituality, two, preservation of life, three, preservation of mind, four, preservation of honor, chastity, and family, and five, the preservation of property and wealth. So, أم نجعل الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات كالمفسدين في الأرض أم نجعل المتقين كالفجار. I guess the scholars that said that this was related to believer and disbeliever, or a person that is obedient and a sinner, and considered that that's what it's exclusive to, they considered, well, there's the other equivalent ayah to it, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Sad had said, are we going to make, of course, this isn't necessarily a question, but this is to tell you, well, this is impossible to do, and that's not what is going to happen, but it's making you answer that question. So it's letting you know that, just as you recognize that this is impossible and this would not be fair, then in that situation, you answered the question. So this is very common in debate in Quran, where the Quran would debate the non-Muslims, would debate the disbelievers, would debate the munafiqeen, etc., and let them answer those questions, and not the Quran necessarily coming to give them the information, but tell them, well, now that you recognize that the answer to this question is such and such, well, then you would recognize the paradigm to this. So when you look at this, أَمْ نَجْعَلُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ كالمفسدين في الأرض. Are we going to make those that would, one, believe and do what is righteous? The word is كالمفسدين في الأرض. What is kal? This kaf is the kaf of tashbih, and it basically is giving you the simile. So telling you, are they going to be similar? Are they going to be equivalent to those that cause destruction on earth? Or are we going to make al-muttaqeen kal-fujar? Or are we going to make those that are, of course, abiding by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles, those that are maintaining their and consistent with their Islam, be kal-fujar, as those that are fujar? What is al-fujar? Al-fujar, the singular of it, the singular form is fajr, and the root is fajara. What is fajara? So let's, I guess, take it down right there for a little bit, and let's see. So fajara is the root. I want you to look at this one. This one's rather interesting. When you look at the word fajara, okay, so what does that mean? So the word fajara can mean, one, to exceed the limit. And that's why when we say an explosive, it's actually tafjir. Well, how did you go from fajara to exceed the limit to saying it's an explosive? Well, if something is exploding, it's going beyond the limit. It's basically right there, going beyond the limit, and that's why it's exploding. Okay, so a person that is fajr is going beyond the limit with their desires, beyond the limit with their choices, beyond the limit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why they're called fujjar. They went and exceeded the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had designed and had basically listed as this is the parameter that you should be working within, and to go outside of the parameter is fujjar, is basically fujur. Al-fujur is that. Al-fujur is the adjective. Al-fujjar are the plural of the people. Okay, the plural of fajr, basically. Okay, and of course, حسب الذين اجترحوا السيئة أن نجعلهم كالذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات. So we mentioned before that some scholars actually said that al-khabith wa tayyib. So first we said halal haram to mu'min kafir. The third contrast, muti' and asi. Where did they take this interpretation from? Well, they took it from this ayah and they said, well, let's look at this ayah in Surah al-Jathiyah. It basically said, أَمْ حَسِبَ الَّذِينَ جَتَرَحُوا. What is the word جَتَرَحُوا? جَتَرَحُوا السَّيِّئَات means that they had committed a sayyat, committed the sins. Are they going to be equal to those that had believed and done what is righteous? But wait a minute, what is the word ijtarahu? Where's it coming from compared to fajara? Okay, let's look at the word ijtarahu. What is the root? The root is jaraha. And jaraha actually means to slit. To slit, to make a small wound, to slit a wound, to make a cut. What are you doing right there? You're causing a wound, you're infecting, what are you doing right there? You are letting that body basically get some form of an opening, and that is going to lead to other things infecting the body. Look at that. So this one is taking you to recognize that when you commit a sin, what you're doing is that you are harming your body by letting different infections, different contaminations basically enter your healthy body, and without you realizing, it's going to affect your body, it's going to affect you mentally, it's going to affect you spiritually, and then that's ijtarahu sayyat. So all the different sins that one might commit, they would think of it as, it's not affecting me, it's not a big deal, come on, it's okay, don't make a big deal of it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, they actually ijtarahu sayyat. They had really transgressed, they had basically caused this kind of an infection, and that's going to harm their body, that's going to harm them mentally, that's going to harm them spiritually, that's going to harm not only them, and perhaps it might actually harm the society as well. They cannot be equal. What is a sayyi'ah? A sayyi'ah comes from the root sa'a. Wait, what is that? So sa'a means to harm. So as-sayyi'at is the plural of sa'a, which basically means sayyi'at. It's basically telling you a number of different harms, a number of different wrong behaviors. That's where ijtarahu sayyi'at comes in. And naj'alahum, are they going to be equivalent? Are they going to be equal to those that had been one in faith and done what is righteous? What were they doing? So ijtarahu sayyi'at means that Does that make a person that is اجترح السيئات a kafir? The answer is no. A person that had committed a sin is not a kafir per se, but if they were to be consistent in committing السيئات, they may get into this massive contamination / infection that might actually harm them spiritually and perhaps even harm their aqidah as well. That's why you could say, كَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, and telling you, are those people going to be equal to the believers and those that would do good? Well, it depends on how far this contamination, the sin in the beginning might be, well, the person probably, I don't know, stole maybe $20 and then they kind of got the hang of stealing, and it became from stealing $20 to later on probably stealing 5,000, 10,000, then probably later on becoming a professional thief. I know it sounds very, it sounds like they're formal, all right? But at the end, without us realizing, it really started out with a wrong behavior. اجترحوا السيئات. It was just a small, I guess, going off track, but then it became so contaminated that it contaminated the person's mind, the person's spirituality, the person's behavior, and this person became fully contaminated. Look at that. اجترحوا. Just look into it. You really have to look into these words. The best maw'idha is really the maw'idha. And what is a maw'idha? Maw'idha is a good word to get you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The best one that you can get to really understanding are the ones that are coming from the ayat. To really take those words into deeper scrutiny, to really understand it closer and closer, to see what and why did it use that particular word and what can we learn out of it. Let's see. So فالخبيث لا يساوي الطيب مقدارا ولا إنفاقا ولا مكانا ولا ذهابا. So basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, well, the different contaminated things, whether we're speaking about visions, ideologies, or whether we're speaking about behaviors, or whether we're speaking about, in the long run, the implication, hell or Jannah, that they cannot whatsoever be equal, not in their amount, and certainly not in the implication and what they lead to, and certainly not in their value, and not certainly what results they would bring. So you would say tayyib, taking us to the right side, and what is khabith and what is contaminated or what is evil is definitely going to take us in the other end, and therefore they cannot be whatsoever equal. And of course, this is to fully reject the whole idea of relativism. The idea of relativism basically regards that there is no truth, but one truth, which is there is no truth. And that's, yes, definitely, that's also postmodernism. Postmodernism is actually based on a couple different ideas, and relativism is one of those things that it depends on. Postmodernism is pretty much the Sharia of atheism or new atheism. So let me just break it down a little bit, because when we're speaking about this, I think it's extremely important to understand this idea, because this ayah is coming at the heart of destructing this whole idea of postmodernism or this whole idea of relativism. So postmodernism regards that, of course, it's basically, number one, it's the Sharia, or call it the Sharia of new atheism. So new atheism regards that, one, there is no God. It's just basically whatever that you see around you. It's matter in motion. That's what That's what founded this whole world. There is no purpose behind life, and it's that you make your own purpose in existentialism. And of course, in postmodernism, since it regards there's no truth, since it regards that everything is created in absurdity, then therefore there's no such thing as a right way to do something. So you would basically just have your own narrative instead of searching for truth. It's you making up your own truth, and instead of considering a certain pattern, it's you basically expressing absurdity instead of you considering that there is something that is ethical. No, just talk about it from an emotional stance. So let's not talk about whether we were created male, female. Let's just talk about that we feel in a certain way. I feel that this is what I am, etc. So it's basically emphasizing that because it considers that everything is founded on absurdity and there's no purpose to it. You would just make your own purpose, and that's where the whole concept and the whole, I guess, philosophy of relativism comes in. Relativism regards that there's no right and wrong. It's all nisbi, it's all relative. You've got your perspective and I've got my perspective. I've got my orientation. You've got your orientation. You've got your choices. You feel certain things. So I would have to respect your feelings. And that's where the whole idea of that political correctness comes in. Hey, we would just regard that there's no right thing, so you just have to use some form of a politically correct language in order to embrace everyone and not consider any foundation or anything as a basis of right and wrong. And unfortunately, we could see a lot of Muslims falling within this rhetoric and within this narrative and thinking that it's all about, hey, just respect one another. We're not saying do not disrespect, but we're saying there is a foundation of right, and certainly there is a foundation of what makes something right and wrong, and therefore the whole idea and the whole culture of do not be judgmental is actually is basically against Islam, because Islam is about telling you, is really about telling, in order to tell you, لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب ولو أعجبك كثرة الخبيث. So Islam is really there to tell you that no, they're not equal, and you have to be judgmental in distinguishing between what is right, what is wrong, what is an obedient person, what is a disobedient person, what is halal, what is haram, what is good, what is ethical, what is not ethical. Islam was about the whole idea of letting you recognize that there is something called a path of truth, a path of falsehood, a path of sin, and a path of obedience, a path of good and a path of good and a path of evil. So that's basically in order to let us recognize that no, it's not all about let's just make everything equal and let's just respect and all of that. No, there is no respect to sin. There is no respect and no tolerance, definitely, to wronghood. Wronghood is to be terminated, is to do, whether we're terminating it, if we had the power to do so, then do so. If you didn't have the power to do so, then do so with your tongue. In other words, giving the advice, or perhaps the debate if you need to, or perhaps to clarify it orally if you're not capable of doing so, and there was going to be some kind of harm basically happening to you. You weren't capable of having the courage to probably say it. in verbal clarification, then go for the final one, which is at least within your heart, you recognize that this is not right. So this is extremely important. So this isn't to go into some kind of dichotomy and say, hey, you're ordering people or you're intimidating people to attack and so forth. This isn't to use this kind of dichotomy, but this is to say that there is a foundation that Islam is definitely clear about, that these paths cannot be equal, and therefore we have a responsibility to make sure that whenever something is going wrong, whether in an idea or whether in a behavior or whether in probably the implication of it, we have the responsibility, one, in terms of ideas, we have the responsibility to do our da'wah, whether it's in giving maw'idha or whether it's in debate or whether it's in perhaps maybe giving durus or whatever it is. We've got that responsibility in discussing the ideas in terms of behaviors. If we had the power as a parent or perhaps maybe as a person in a Senate, government, whatever it is, we had the power to make something legal, illegal, or we had the power to stop something, then in that situation, we definitely have to get engaged and make sure that justice prevails, and justice based on the definition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in terms of three, if basically you had the ability to stop it, at least stop the consequence of probably leading to harm, then in that situation, that's what you had to do. Okay, let's see. Now, based on that, al-Qurtubi wanted to take us to a second matter. Let's just take a minute of pausing for a bit. Al-Qurtubi wanted to take us into a different matter, even though certainly he was laying the foundations when we're speaking about idea or the basis of it, at least the paradigm right there. But then he went into a different matter, which really is related to transactions. Are transactions, if basically we're speaking about a valid transaction, what is a valid transaction? You're talking about a valid transaction is not necessarily based on consent. Now, I want you to stop at the word consent right there, because in the West, of course, considering that the individual is the foundation of what marks as basically, I would say, the foundation of right and wrong, but that's not necessarily the case in Islam. So consent is not necessarily considered as the place of sanctity in Islam, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the place of sanctity. In Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the foundation of truth. And in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center of truth. And that's why when we would talk about, well, what defines good and what defines justice, we would basically go back to the resources of Quran and Sunnah / al-Wahi, because that's the foundation of truth to us.
I'm confused. Okay, so
hold on, Noura. I'll get
sorry.
to it. I know you're gonna. I know you're confused for a bit. Versus in the Western culture, it regards the individual as the foundation of truth, as the foundation of justice. So that's why when you look at consent, okay, when you look at consent, it is considered as an area of the highest level of sanctity. So you look at consent because the individual marks as the foundation of truth, the foundation of what is right and wrong, and the individual basically is. If we're talking about in accumulated numbers, in large numbers, then it would basically consider that as right there. We're talking about democracy, considering it as, well, this is what marks respecting the individual or the individuals, and therefore in the Western ideology, it regards that if there's the individual consent, that's enough to consider something as being good, because we're seeing consent, which is considered as what marks something as holy. It's the individual. But in Islam, it basically made it clear that not because something is in an abundant number, whether we're speaking about a certain culture, embracing an idea and regarding it in a number that is in a large number, it doesn't necessarily make it right. So the foundation in Islam, the center in Islam, is basically regarding it as to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, a Muslim is supposed to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, versus in the West, if there is consent, then that should be respected. And therefore, when you're seeing consensual adults or adults that are consenting to something, that's basically the space of personal freedom. And therefore, that should be the area that would be later on be considered as the foundation, whether we should make it as legal or not. So, Noura, now what do we mean by consent? So when we speak about consent, in the West, of course, we're speaking about perhaps consenting to certain practices, whether in public or private, you know what I mean, or consenting to perhaps certain transactions, consenting. So the government might put certain restrictions on what it allows to be legal despite somebody consenting. So let's say,
Maybe, yeah, if you could give an example.
let's give an example. You know, I'm going to change my spot and go somewhere else. All right, everyone. The kids are not going to school, and therefore I can't focus. They're around me. So I might get a bad connection, but let me fix that really quick.
I think all of our kids are home now, so don't worry.
Oh, well, it's completely different than when you're listening than actually the person that's talking. Let me give you an idea. When we're speaking about consensual, let's say consensual sexual behavior, maybe toxicants, using certain toxicants, perhaps just because the person gave consent to drink or gave consent to a certain sexual behavior that, yes, that is according to the Western culture, that's to be respected. So that's that area where in Islam we would say there's the line. Yes, consent is to be respected, but if it goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the human consent does not change the reality of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded as right and wrong. There are certain things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded as right, then they're going to stay right. This is basically the foundation of principle. The foundation of justice is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not necessarily human consent. Let's give another example. Okay, so someone might ask you a question, which sometimes can be a loaded question, and tell you, does Islam allow marital rape?
I was just wondering how that was relevant to transactions, I guess.
Well, so Al-Qurtubi wanted to talk about al-bay' al-fasid and all of that. We're going to get to that. We're going to get there, Noura, but I
okay,
wanted
I
to get
apologize.
to, yeah, we're going to get there. It's not necessarily only money, but I wanted to take that which is relevant to our times. Okay, let's talk about a little bit. You know, people might ask, well, is marital rape allowed in Islam, for example? It's a loaded question. So the answer is yes and no. Well, how is it yes and no? Islam does not consider there's such a thing as marital rape. Why not? Because in Islam, the consent did happen at the day of the marriage contract. In the Western culture right now, they're discussing marital rape and it's big on the media, and certainly the feminists are basically rallying for that and all of that. But then Islam considers that when we're speaking about proving somebody committing a crime, we basically have to have solid evidence. If we wanted to basically prove that this person had committed a crime, then we basically have to recognize that there was their consent in the beginning or not. If they are together, if they are married, and it would be hard to sometimes interpret what and when consent actually happened. So Islam says the consent happened at the day of the marriage contract. But what if she was showing signs that she wasn't interested? Would that make it a crime? So we do have other hadith that definitely discourage men from engaging in intimacy if the woman was not feeling that she was interested. At the same time, it definitely does encourage women that if your husband wanted to be intimate, that you would be there, basically, and be available, okay, to make sure that this stays within the halal limits. So when you're looking at Islam, so why couldn't we consider that her consent at that moment? Because Islam said, well, wait a minute, we do have consent. The consent was at the day of the marriage contract. That's basically what we would consider as the solid evidence. And the other, perhaps different expressions at the time, we can not necessarily use that because it's an area of shak, it's an area of doubt. And when we want to charge anybody of committing an assault or a crime, we would have to base things based on solid evidence. So at that moment, we don't really know. So let's switch all of this. Let's say two adults consented to committing sexual relations. They both consented. They're both okay with it. Does Islam regard that as permissible? No. Islam will charge them with committing an assault. If there were 4 witnesses, will charge them with committing the assault of zina, even though they both consented. Why am I talking about all of this? I just want you to see that in Islam, just because we have certain adults or certain people consenting to a certain transaction, to a certain behavior, it does not necessarily make it right. So when we look at al-bay' al-fasid, he said yufsakh. What is al-bay' al-fasid? Al-bay' al-fasid is basically, it's supposed to be an invalid transaction. But let's just assume that they both agreed to it. They both consented that, well, I'm okay. I wanted to sell you, let's say, marijuana. I wanted to sell you that, and you got the money. I consented. We both, hey, got the money. I consented. I sold you this product. Is this going to be permissible? We just consented to it. Okay. Well, just like in the West, they would contradict themselves in some things. They would consider that, yes, consent is going to be accepted here, but other things they'll say, even if you both consented to sell marijuana, at least in certain states in the US, they would still consider that as an illegal transaction. So when is human consent supposed to be as a center and as a foundation to making something as legitimate, and when is human consent basically disregarded? You could see that there is a lot of, I would say, confusion, and you could see that human consent, or at least the consent, especially when it comes to sexuality, you could see a lot of space is given within that area that, yes, it's as long as they're consenting, that's fine. Same sex, as long as they're consenting. But when it comes to polygamy, even if it's consenting adults, it's actually not considered as something that is legitimate, even if they're consenting adults. Go ahead, Nora.
I just think you need to clarify because when you think about rape, you think about violence. You know what I mean? So wouldn't that be two separate things? The
Two separate things.
intimacy or because
Are you
when
talking
you're
about marital rape? Is that there you're talking about?
yeah, because
Okay.
when you get married, I mean it's haram to leave a mark. Isn't it haram to leave a mark on a
Right.
body or
So let me explain
Yeah.
something. So he
I just
will
wanted
be,
you to clarify because you're
Yeah. So if the man committed, let's say, some form of a relationship, whether we're speaking about a sexual relationship or whether we're speaking, let's say, I don't know, he came to her and he said, make me a cup of coffee. But then he didn't just say, make me a cup of coffee. No, he held her by the hair and said, I want you to do the cup of coffee. And basically, let's say, banged her head against the wall or whatever. Okay. This is not acceptable. Okay. Even if it's for a cup of coffee. Same thing if we're talking about using form of violence slash harming the body, whether you are hitting, whether you are bruising the body, whether you're abusing it or bruising the body outside the body, or whether internally, it's going to be considered as a form of harm. Harm in Islam is haram. Okay. And that's why I said when people would ask, is marital rape haram or halal? I would say it's a yes and no, because it's not considered rape because the consent actually happened at the marriage contract. But it is considered an assault if that person harmed the body. So let's say cause some internal bruises, etc. The person would not be charged for zina per se, but the person would be charged for harm, okay, in Islam. So just causing any harm, whether the bruising, all of these different marks, etc., that would be the harm the person is going to be charged for, and not necessarily as a zina charge. You understand what I'm saying, Noura?
Yes, Jazakallah khair for clarifying that.
And this is important to keep in mind, because when we're speaking about zina, for a person to be charged if they're married, that would actually mean stoning. Okay? And in Islam, إدراء الحدود بالشبهات. We're supposed to be finding different reasons to basically the benefit of the doubt for who? For the person that is accused of committing a crime, because they're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. So I'm supposed to be looking for different gray areas that might be basically benefiting them with using this area of doubt. So we cannot charge this person of rape slash zina because the consent already happened at the marriage contract. But the person will be trialed for harm if they had really harmed the person, probably caused internal bleeding, bruising, etc. Then that situation, whether you had done it on the person's face or the person's legs, or whether you had done it on their private parts, it's going to be the same thing. So not because they are married, it doesn't mean that he can somehow harm her, on her private parts and say, well, you gave consent. No, then no consent was given to harm. Okay. So going back to this one, إن البيع الفاسد يفسخ, the general rule and the default ruling in Islam is that we go back to defining a right transaction, a right behavior, what is justice and what is just, etc. We go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. If any transaction or if any behavior was done contradicting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as legal slash halal slash sahih, if it goes against it, then in that situation, this is to become invalid and basically to become void. Not because they had probably gone a long way in their transaction, it doesn't make it legal. Okay, so let's just say this person made a transaction, they bought, yeah, let's not talk about maybe marijuana because then we're going to get into a debate whether used for medical, as a medical drug or what was it used for, etc. We'll just use something like cocaine, okay, complete street drugs, okay? Just because this person bought a house with it and used it in that way, that doesn't necessarily mean that that transaction becomes legal or that that transaction becomes halal. البيع الفاسد, that's it. It's يفسخ. What is, and same thing when we're speaking about basically when we're speaking about perhaps not only transactions, but same thing when we're speaking about perhaps different behaviors, not because this was later on practiced differently. Let's talk about marriage, okay? Let's just suppose this man and this woman, they got married. But then later on, they discovered that this man and this woman, they were actually milk brothers and sisters. But they already had 5 kids. Just because they had 5 kids, we won't legalize this and say, well, let's just, we have a family now. We don't want to end this family. They're a happy family, a happy couple. We can't end them. Let's just dismiss that they were ever milk brothers and sisters and milk siblings, and let's just let them move on. No, if the foundation of it is wrong, no matter how long had passed, it is still founded on wrong, and therefore it must be void and it must be terminated. That's what we want to get to. It becomes void, it becomes terminated just because time had passed and people consented to the new circumstances. We don't change the truth of the matter that this goes against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as legal, what he had considered as basically what is right. And that comes in, and that's why al-Qurtubi, we're really smart, basically wanted to say, وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ. Even if we're speaking about time had probably passed, or whether people and more people consented to it, or whether it became a public act that had become normalized, we're not going to change the truth in order to get more, I guess, acceptance, or to get, I guess, in terms of getting normalized with the situation. If it is wrong, it's wrong, regardless of how people see it, regardless of how much time had passed. If it's wrong, it must be terminated. It must be fully stopped. It must be opposed. It must be right there, brought to the right path and brought to justice. You see what I'm saying? Is it clear, everybody? I want you to just put yourself, I guess, within this area to help us see the truth and the foundation of truth, and not necessarily how we would get normalized with certain things. Okay, let's see. So let's just assume, well, you've got some scholars, let's look at this one. When we're talking about transactions, and they said, لا يفسخ نظرا إلى أن البيع إذا فسخ ورد بعد الفوت يكون فيه ضرر وغبن على البائع. So you do have another opinion in regards to transactions, okay? There's a difference when we're talking about transactions and when we're talking about marriage or other things. You got another opinion that said if a transaction already happened, and let's just say a long time had passed, okay, do we necessarily consider that we're going to basically end the transaction, or what do we really do right there? And especially if a long time had basically passed, how do we relate to all of this? All right. And some scholars actually said, well, we're going to consider if long time had passed and there is something, pay attention to this one, everybody. This is not always necessarily the case, but there is something called السقوط بالتقادم. What does that mean? And how do we understand this? So there are certain things that you had an amount of time to come forward to court and reject what had happened or announce that you refuse all of this. There are certain things that are not necessarily based on how the transaction happened, but it's relating to your consent. Okay? Let me give you an example. Let's just assume Noura gave me her car to use. So, and then someone came over to me and said, hey, I like your car. I'll buy it for you. I'll buy it from you for $25,000. Do I own the car? I don't own the car. But I already know that Noura only bought it for $10,000. So I thought she wouldn't mind if I would sell it for $25,000 because I know she only bought it for $10,000. So I basically right there sell the car for $25,000 and I go to Noura and I say, hey, Noura, guess what? I just sold your car for $25,000 and I just want you to right there sign the title in order for me to give this car, and here's your money. Noura, basically, right there, she signed a title and took the $25,000. And then later on, maybe 5 years later, she comes forward and she was like, remember, you sold my car and I did not consent to it. I said, Noura, you signed the title. And she said, yeah, but that's because I had no choice. Did you take your $25,000? You did. But I didn't consent to it. You claimed that you didn't consent to it. But guess what? 5 years had passed. You did not object to it. السقوط بالتقادم. You signed the title. You could have said, no, I don't want to sign the title. The $25,000, you have to basically return it to the person. I don't want the $25,000. I want my $10,000 car. So in that situation, who's going to be at fault? Is it me for selling her $10,000 beautiful car? And therefore, let's just assume this person, he gave me the $25,000. But then this person basically takes the car, which is worth $10,000, and gets into a car accident. What a mess. And right now, Noura, she's like, wait a minute, I want my $10,000 car. And I'm
That's
right
not me.
there.
You're talking about somebody else.
I know, Noura, I'm just, you know. Noura, would you take the $25,000 or would you take would you want the $10,000 car?
Actually, I was okay. I would do the right thing.
Yeah, well, what is right?
Actually, I was trying to jot down some Arabic you were writing on the screen, so I kind of missed that.
That's okay. Here goes your $10,000 car, Noura. Sorry. All right. Okay, so now السقوط بالتقادم, when we're speaking about certain transactions, certain time. If a certain time had passed, and in that situation, the person to come forward and claim that they want their right back, sometimes we would look right there at the situation, and based on that, we would determine whether that agreement, remember, there was no agreement because I don't own the car. So since I don't own the car, I don't have the right to make a transaction on something I don't own. But Nora, she signed the title, and that marked as a form of consent. Okay? So in that situation, the transaction that I did with that person, okay, even though I don't own the car, is that transaction going to be valid or invalid? If I did the transaction, sold the car to this person, and Nora refused to sign the contract, then the transaction is void and completely terminated because I don't own the car. Then there's no sale. Even if I used the money and probably bought another car with it, you don't own the car, Aisha. You don't have the right to sell the car. But what if the car got into an accident? Bad luck for you. Now you have to pay back the money and whatever the value of that car to Noura. And in that situation, you also have to pay back the $25,000 to the person that gave you the $25,000. Now you owe $35,000. One, the $25,000 to that guy. Two, the $10,000 basically to Noura that basically gave you her car to use. Can we charge the person that did the accident to probably compensate for the car, etc.? Then we would go into a qada. Okay, just wanted to let you see that just because we had a wrong foundation, how do we understand the implication? And later on, how do we understand the transactions that happened? So just to understand that piece of it. Did anybody get lost? No? Okay.
No, that makes sense.
That makes sense. Okay. So let's see.
But I'm just curious, if somebody had a loan on a car and wanted to sell it in Islam, I mean, I know here it's totally different because here, but I'm just curious.
So it would be based on the conditions, the terms and conditions that basically you had agreed on with the person, with whatever person that basically gave you the loan, or whether it's a bank. So that would basically go based on the terms and conditions on who really owns it, how much you pay back, etc. And are you really in Islam? There's no such thing as selling a dain. There's no such thing as selling a person's debt. You can't sell debt. That's a form of riba.
Oh, wow. SubhanAllah. I'm glad I asked.
It is. That's a form of riba. Okay. So then we go into, okay, how do we deal with this? Then that's a huge.
Wow, SubhanAllah,
Right. You can't sell riba. It's it's riba. You can't sell, dain. It's riba.
And you can't buy it, right?
And you can't buy it.
SubhanAllah.
So, right. So then we would go into, well, what's a term and a condition that is allowed and all of that. Then we'll go into those details. Okay. So what is preponderant? The first opinion said, no, if it's an illegal, invalid transaction, it stays illegal and it stays invalid. and it's to be terminated, and basically the price is to be returned to the person that that bought the items. And if anything was basically destroyed, then in that situation they have the responsibility to be liable for it, and because they were trusted with it. So according to this opinion, the person that hit the car, basically got into a car accident, they're supposed to be liable for the car. Or is it the other person, which basically took the $25,000 as a price? They weren't given the consent. Who's going to be liable for the car? Is it the person that took the car, or is it the person that basically sold the car, the second person? Okay, you could see right there, you're going to have differences of opinions, but let's just see right there. Okay, the second opinion basically said, لا يفسخ, we wouldn't necessarily terminate the transaction, because if you were to terminate the transaction after a period of time, then you're going to have some form of depreciation. And basically, let's just say this car, that is a $10,000 car, let's say time had passed and the Noura didn't even know because she was out of the country. She basically thought she basically thought that I was still using the car as basically agreed upon, that I would just use the car while she's out of the country. But then she comes back, discovers that the car was actually sold when she didn't even consent to it, and discovers that the mileage was so high on it. Now the car, it used to be worth $10,000. Now this person had been using it to probably, I don't know, go and travel out of state. Now the mileage went from 96 miles, 96,000, let's say, to right now probably 250,000. Now the car is worth probably right now with such a high mileage, probably worth right now $3,500. So definitely there's a huge depreciation. And is that necessarily fair? What are we going to do? And that takes us into the second opinion. They basically said, well, we wouldn't necessarily consider that terminating the transaction because of the huge depreciation, but we'll basically look into then seeing who is going to be responsible for all of this. And it's basically supposed to be the person that sold the car. They're the ones that are going to be responsible for all of this, because this person basically had used and misused a property that they don't own. Let's say the Prophet ﷺ said in general, "Man amila amalan laysa alayhi amruna fahuwa radd." Whoever does any action which is not based on what the Prophet ﷺ had laid out in terms of principle, then that's going to be rejected. And that basically includes all the different actions, and of course, if it doesn't go with the details of what was illustrated in the books of fiqh, even if it basically became abundant in the different matters, or it became normalized, etc., that doesn't change the truth of the matter, is that it is an invalid transaction from the beginning, and therefore, just because a long time had passed, it doesn't make it right. And that's the same thing. What if a person basically stole land? And what they did, they stole land, let's just say, right now, of course, in Syria. You had a lot of people, we're talking about almost 7 million displaced. Many basically ran out of the country. Many ended up losing their homes, and many, they left their homes and just left. And of course, many are going to come back. And certainly, others that are coming back, they're going to see that some people lived in their home, or probably maybe renovated a certain home. They're like, yeah, well, part of the house is torn down, a bomb fell on it, but I'll fix the rest of the house and I'll, I guess, renovate the area that was, destroyed. And then, hey, I'll just take over this house. Then let's say this person comes back from Germany, comes back to see that another family had lived in their home. What are you doing here? Oh, well, I renovated this side of it and that side of it, and I made a very beautiful, nice driveway. And guess what? And I even cropped all these plants around the house. This house is now mine. The person comes in and is like, well, guess what? I have the evidence to prove that this is my home. I just ran away because the Shabiha and the government, Assad government, wanted my son to join the army, and we had to leave the country. So what do? Does person two that fixed the house and renovated the house basically have the right over the house now? Or is this second person that came back from Germany supposed to go back to their house? What do? The person that owned the house initially is basically going to take the house. So what about all the renovations that this
Yeah,
person?
I had a question about that because
Right. What about all the renovations that this person had done to the house?
shouldn't the people who were stealing the house, because that's what it is, shouldn't they have to pay to redo the house to be how it was before?
Right. So that's where differences of opinions on what actually makes a fair judgment. Do we basically consider that person A, which basically is the person that came in, found this house and renovated it and built whatever, does that person, number one, no scholar said that that person becomes the owner. Okay, there's no doubt about that. They don't become the owner. This house does not belong to you. This house belongs to this person that basically fled this place because of the war. But the question is, what about all the renovations that this person had done on the house, and plus probably planting and all of that? There's some effort that was put in there. Do we charge person B, which is the person that went to Germany, do we charge the person to basically pay the cost? Or do we say, sorry, person A, thank you for all the investment, but person B does not owe it to you because they didn't tell you to do that. You did it on your own. We didn't tell you to do that. So that's where that differences of opinions comes in. Some scholars actually said, well, we would tell person B, this person renovated this amount. This is what they renovated. This is what the cost is. So please pay person A for the good things that they had invested.
But who said they're necessarily good?
Hold on.
Sorry.
The second opinion basically said that no, this person did not consent to any of this, then therefore you can't ask them to be responsible to pay this person in any shape or form because that person voluntarily did a service which no one asked them to do. Therefore, this is the preponderant, wallahu alam. You voluntarily fixed in an area that doesn't belong to you. You planted, you did all of this. Well, good for you. You definitely got some service. You lived in that house probably for who knows some time. I'm not asking you for rent, or can I ask them for rent? Now that's a different question.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, can I ask them for rent and say, hey, you lived in my house for 2 years and now I'm back. I expect you to pay rent. then that's a different question. That's another debate between scholars. Can I charge them for rent? Or can I not charge them for rent because there was no agreement in a contract done in the beginning? In order for me to charge them for rent, there should have been a contract. The second debate comes in and says, well, even if there wasn't a contract, we would basically consider that there would be an equivalent pricing for it. And certainly they stayed in a property that doesn't belong to them. And if the other person wanted to charge them for rent, then that would be fair because we could look at the situation. Wallahu a'lam is that there was no contract. They would not be charged for rent because the place was actually left unattended. The place was basically right there, not showing any sign of being owned by anybody. It was right there, open property, so the person, wallahu alam, would not be charged for rent. But if the real owner comes and proves ownership for that home, then in that situation, this home belongs to that person, and the person that fixed the house, and I don't know what they put in it, they would have the right to take their items. So if, let's say, I don't know, they put a sink in it, you want to take your sink, go ahead. You want to take your tub, you put a jacuzzi in it, okay, good for you. You can take all your stuff if that's what you put in it, but then the actual home belongs to the person that owns the home.
What about them being charged for stealing? Because this, if you lock
Did they
your
steal
house,
anything? What did they steal? How
the
can you?
house.
Well, the house is there. The house was empty.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
I was actually watching a video. Some family, I guess they came back from Turkey and they were washing walls and fixing some things. And they said, we were looking for a home and we found a home and we found a place to stay in. And that's why, I thought of this example because I was looking and watching this video of people actually doing that. It's like, actually, this home doesn't belong to you. And I'm sure, even though it was a corrupt government, but I'm sure there will be documents to prove which home belongs to who. Even if it's a corrupt government, there were some documents to prove ownership for certain homes. All right, here's what we'll do. We'll stop at here, inshallah. There's really a lot to say. Okay, and inshallah, we'll stop here. We'll continue tomorrow, inshallah. And yes, it's quite interesting to get into transactions after talking about hunting. Okay, so I guess yeah, this is it. So subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilaik nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And Nuda saying, should they have been charged for stealing? No, they shouldn't be charged for stealing because stealing is taking something min al-hirz. What does that mean? So stealing, it's in order to charge anybody for stealing, that would mean you're taking something that was actually put in a secure place. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's just say you put your, I don't know, your gold on the floor and you just, I don't know, you just put your gold on the floor and you were in the park and you just put it there and you walked away. And I found it and I just took it. Is that considered stealing? No, it's not. Well, let's just assume you put your gold inside, I guess, your car was locked. Now that's supposed to be حرز. That's supposed to be a secure place. I broke into your car and basically opened the different pockets in your car.
So it would
took
depend
the,
on if the house had a lock, or
yes,
okay,
absolutely.
okay.
If there is a hirz, okay? If something is secured, that's what would make a difference. It wouldn't be considered stealing if it was not secured. So they wouldn't be charged for stealing because, hey, everything is basically right there. You could see the doors are broken, the house is, 20,
Oh
30%
yeah, okay. I see
demolished.
what you're
That's
saying.
not a hirz. That's not a hirz. That's not a secure thing.
Okay,
They wouldn't
especially if
be
a
charged for
bomb fell on, yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So that
Okay,
wouldn't
that
be a
makes
hirz.
sense. Jazakallah khair.
All right. So this is it. Sorry for the weird examples I'm giving. It's either me or Noura, but I
We need
tried
we
to
need
make
some we need some like just weird names.
weird names. Okay, not me
I'm
and Noura. Okay.
just kidding.
Okay.
I'm just actually, it got my attention. Anyway,
Okay. Okay. So this is it, inshallah. Stay tuned for more. I know there's always a lot to say, but I guess just learning how we understand fiqh and how we understand, I guess, the legal system, how we understand the foundation of fiqh and how they debated all of this. I absolutely love it. And I know sometimes if we were to talk about it in theory, gets confusing, and you would really want an example to break it down and to help you see it in a demonstrated example than the ideas being, I guess, too theoretical and too wordy. So I hope I was successful in laying out those ideas.
mashallah, it helps relate the concept to our lives.
Absolutely.
Jazakallah.
Absolutely. وإياكم. So this is it, inshallah. And let me right there just pause the recording and stuff.
How